Hi everyone, welcome back to Class 101. Bryce Coe here, and today we'll be studying robots and armored characters as a simplified way to understand the human figure. Okay, so for materials, I'll be using the Kuretake fine tip pen, and we'll be using the same mixed media pad. And let's just get right to it. Okay, so let's get to our first example, which is an armored character here. And the reason that we want to be looking at characters like this is because they're a step towards our eventual goal of covering real human anatomy. Think of them as taking the simple box version of human anatomy that we covered in the first chapter and turning some of those boxes into more nuanced shapes. So let's break down this guy together. Okay, so for the head here, there's a lot of interesting landmarks on it that are eventually going to be a guide for us when we draw a real human face. And I'm still primarily thinking this as somewhat of a rounded box. So I'll just draw that over here. So the reason that I see a rounded box is because I see kind of like a very clear side plane. It's a bit cylindrical, rounded at the top, but this to me is like a side, and then that line that comes across the front of the box here kind of reveals this front plane. And what I like about this particular piece of armor is that this line that comes across here is kind of like the eye line of the human face, which is where the eyes would be, and that's because, practically speaking, that's where the character who's wearing this armor needs to look out from. So that helps us find that line, which is important. And then the other thing that's interesting here is that he's got kind of like a center line here that goes right down to where the nose would be. And it comes to a point here in this particular armor. But it comes to a point at the precise point which the tip of the nose would be. And then kind of just comes down to the chin. The top of this armor here also kind of mirrors where the hairline would be. So it's kind of hinting at a lot of the underlying anatomy of the human underneath this armor, but without being so precise that anyone's going to really feel like, oh my gosh, is his hairline really that far up? Or is his nose really that big? This is kind of just like almost setting up some general landmarks for where we'll eventually want to place real human features underneath, but for now just with some simple shapes. So he's got some cross contours, and then a larger kind of like, I don't know what it's called technically, but like a fin that also follows that center line. And so that's just giving us almost like training wheels towards understanding how to draw the real human character, and good ones because no one's going to mind if we mess up with these. It's just going to be like an interesting piece of armor. Okay, so next is the neck, and in terms of this particular piece of armor, he's got a scarf, but the scarf being basically, we break this down in terms of this guy, this looks, you know, what is that, about a quarter of the height of the head. Kind of a stout neck there. And as we move on towards the chest, this is like, you know, it's not drastically different from the chest box that we are maybe seeing inside of, but it is kind of mirroring a bit more of what the human form is like. It's more rounded on the bottom. You know, the human torso is not a perfect hard edge box. It has got this rounded waist here. And on this top box here, the armor is kind of, it's similarly evoking the collarbone, so the collarbone would be something like that, but instead it's using that kind of line and flourishing it out to kind of make this almost like a collar. Not collarbone, just collar. Okay. He's got a center line going down here, but this line isn't, you know, perfectly straight because it's kind of following the line that the chest might if he had, you know, larger pec chest muscles and then came down towards like a slimmer waist. That's what that line kind of is showing. What's really cool too with this armor is that he's got like almost like a perfect slice of where the arm comes out of. And this is an asymmetrical model where this is getting covered up, but copying this model is not really what we're interested in today. We're just trying to see what the kind of general shapes that a piece of armor has that can help us understand what the underlying human forms are in a simplified way. Okay, so for the shoulder here, the shoulder is a really important piece of human anatomy that, you know, we wouldn't cover as far as the box understanding of this basic shape is. But adding that kind of complication to the human anatomy, where it's like, okay, yeah, the shoulder's like where like sometimes a really cool muscle is, we are able to see how this is kind of an exaggerated version of that shape. I think on this side it's a bit more covered up, but it's also a bit larger as a kind of like really rounded, large, almost half sphere here. And this is the sort of muscle that can really help define an arm as opposed to like maybe if it's not very strong or muscular. This one standing out is a really helpful landmark. And for armor, what's a kind of a unique thing about it is it's a little bit more mistake-proof as well. You know, if you're thinking about drawing this shoulder pad and you thought that the shoulder was smaller, then like that's okay. This is just now part of that piece of armor, just part of the design. You can decide to add cross contours to hide any mistake like that. I think this side has it slightly better as that example. So if I drew the shoulder too long, then I can just turn that into part of the design. Okay, so the next piece of human anatomy I want to get to is the elbow. The elbow is great because thinking about landmarks for how long the arm should be, it's, you know, directly halfway down where you'll have the upper tricep part of the arm and the lower forearm. So this right here is always something that I'm looking for to help me know at which point I'm going to bend the arm and at which point I can start knowing where this might go this way or that way or whatever, depending on the pose I have in mind. And the distance of the shoulder to that elbow is going to be about the same to the wrist. So, you know how we previously talked about these being boxes? They're still having very clearly defined top and side planes, but you know, in reality, this is more of a nuanced shape, more of a cylindrical kind of curve to it. And armor is a really clear example of how that can be exaggerated if you don't know exactly what the width of the form should be. it can just come off as looking like thick armor. Whereas when you draw a real arm, it's going to need to be a bit slimmer. Okay, getting to the hand, I still think it's most helpful at this stage to think of the hand as a box where the top plane of it is, just the top part here. The thing that complicates the hand is really understanding the thumb and the pinky. The thumb here, I like to think that this is primarily a flat box and that this is kind of coming out of the side plane of that box. So here you can kind of see it. This is the top plane and then this comes off the side of it. It's almost just like a angled cylinder coming off, something like that. And the thumb just being a cylinder chunk coming off of this piece here. I don't really think I even myself think of the fingers as being much more complicated than boxes coming off of that hand box, but there is nuance as far as like showing slight contour shapes that are more cylindrical to show that these aren't hard edged, they are rounded. And then in the case of armor, it's great because you can draw those major shapes and then all the in-between knuckles and kind of like more nuanced pieces can be kind of hidden as just being the connective tissue of those major box shapes. Okay, so moving on, I'm gonna go straight to the torso here. This particular model is hiding a lot of what's going on at the hip box, but it is a good example of how to hide something that maybe you don't know how to draw so well, which is to like just have a general understanding that this is the hip, and drawing some objects on top of it that kind of trace that contour if they were to wrap around that box. In this case, he's got like 3 belts. That's just one way to maybe hide your lack of understanding on something, which is totally okay. Slowly working towards understanding the things you want to draw is the goal, not where you need to be yet. Okay, and it looks like I do not have enough space to completely finish this guy off, but what I will say is that the knees here are similarly useful to the elbow, where they kind of show the midpoint of the leg, so where the leg comes out of the hip box, which is hidden here, granted. This to here helps us know how long the leg is going to be, because it's going to be from here to here for the actual leg. And that's just a great landmark for knowing where you are at a drawing. The legs, these upper kind of thighs, still great to just think of them as kind of like rounded cylinders that kind of will come to this kneecap. You can draw some cross contour lines going along it to help convey that they're rounded shapes, even when the outer outline is just a couple of lines. Okay, I'm not going to leave this guy hanging. For his other arm here, I just want to kind of maybe more simply demonstrate the pieces that we're seeing. So kind of a rounded spear coming into a cylinder for the shoulder. This cylinder here, and I'll do this lightly to do something else afterwards. This cylinder here for the tricep area, going into this joint for the elbow, which also tend to think of it as being kind of a rounded outer edge. Can't see it on this angle, but that connecting to our forearm, continuation of the cylinder getting slightly slimmer, going into the wrist, which is kind of a box shape that extends out to the hand as a box shape. And this is what I'm seeing for that, but then I attach the thumb coming off of the side box there, and for the fingers, you can simply think of them as thick boxes that just extrude out of that top plane, with the pinky being smaller. There's your hand anatomy class. Okay, so these are the major parts. And for armor, if you ever get any of these parts wrong, like the shoulder being too long, as I was saying over here, it's cool because you can just make that part of the design. And if you ever if you made this too small, you can similarly just draw the correct line and make this a part of some sort of flourish. With armor, you're allowed to basically get a lot of attempts to draw it correctly if you draw it wrong the first time by adding more detail. Okay, so I want to draw the same guy but with the legs showing. So the best way to make sure that you can draw the whole character, unlike what I just demonstrated, is to take that moment to pre-visualize what you want to draw. For me, I think the most important thing is to imagine where the feet are landing. So if I want it to land right about here, then imagining the character standing up from that point is what I need to do. And the thing that is almost just imagining this same character transplanted over here, so if you can literally just try to envision it standing there, that's one of the ways that it's helpful if you are planning out a drawing and want a character to be in a certain place. Take the time to pre-visualize it. Okay, so I'm just going to do this real quick. There is the head box with the eye line. He's got kind of like an ear as the kind of hinge for this piece. Neck being less than a quarter of the head. There's the chest. And here is where the arm slots go. So this is kind of like the torso here, simplified torso. Except now we're going to add the arms coming off of it with the upper shoulder pieces. The torso, not torso, the tricep and bicep. The elbow, forearm, wrist, and hand. Hand box I'll leave pretty much as a box. We'll skip essentially the hip box. Maybe I'll make his hip box, or his kind of like that skirt, a bit shorter so that we can show more of the leg. This is kind of the overall hip. Maybe the leg would start around here though. Mirroring the arm over here. Okay, so for the leg, now that we are at this point, the leg starting around here, where the chest is here, this is the hip box, and the legs coming out. The distance from where the leg starts to the knee, which I will simplify with these armor knee pads. I think in the model they're a bit more pointy, but that's okay. See, if I mess up, I just add the point on top. But anyway, this distance here is roughly the same distance to the ankle. So I can connect from here to here and then draw roughly the same distance to the ankle. And in this character here, he's kind of got all that covered with that shin guard there. But to me, the ankle is super helpful because whereas the legs here are kind of rounded out cylinders, this is where you have a clear delineation of a front plane and a side plane. So imagining this as a box that does hit the ground, having this side plane of the ankle versus the front of the kind of the top and front of the foot helps me connect this to the ground. That might just be my own way of understanding how to really plant a foot, but for me it's really helpful. And from this kind of more flat understanding of the foot, then it's connected to the ground, and then I kind of just draw out the extrusion to make the foot itself. In the case here, there's like a little bit of armor going back on the heel, but that's the way I like to understand it. So hopefully that's helpful for your understanding as well. So the cylinder here, this kind of rounded cylinder here, going into that box for a foot. That heel, the heel just kind of has this bump here that I like to draw. It really helps to distinguish the side plane of the foot, and then extruding out the actual foot. Okay, so yes, these are kind of the major parts of the human anatomy as simplified through armor. It's cool because once you start to draw a more realistic human, at any point, if you kind of like don't the specifics of like the muscles or where the bones want to stick out or what have you, having them wear armor is a great way to get away with using simplified human anatomy as opposed to kind of maybe struggling with how the toes or the hands or what have you will look. Okay, so that is an armored example. Let's move on to a robot. Okay, so we have our female robot character here, and it's much of the same deal as the previous example. The real difference with female anatomy, as far as most popular depictions of women go, is that you need to kind of emphasize the curve of the hips and of the breast area and the butt. Otherwise, the arms are just generally more slender, but follow the same basic shapes. Okay, so cool thing about robots, I'm not going to really worry too much about the face or the head anatomy, but in this case, we do have a few indicators that are helpful. So I'm just going to try to draw the character about here, head, chest, and legs. So this helmet, which has ears that I'll ignore, what's helpful about this helmet is that it still has a clear front plane because of that visor setup, and even though it's got ears, it has a side plane that is marked in the middle by this circle, which would be where the ear would be on a regular character. So this is being the side plane, and that being the front plane. Okay. What's cool about robots is that they need to understand the basic components of a human form. You know, like it needs to know that there's a neck here and the head and chest, but the chest doesn't actually need to exactly mirror a human torso. In this case, it's kind of just like a really rounded box. something like that, where the side planes of this box are pretty flat, but the front is more rounded because there's boobs. So this is where the boobs are on this front plane. But the side plane, super flat. It's got a clear space on this model for where the arm comes off of. And really cylindrical neck area. I think that this head might be a little bit too much of a flare out. That's okay. That's just the shape. And so going into this hip area, the top of the chest box here, where the collarbone would be, is generally going to mirror more closely the top of the hips. So if she had real hips, they'd be like something like that. And the place where the curve is from where this part of the rib cage would start for a human, happens to be the end of this chest box into the more abdomen area, and making that curve into the box so that there's kind of that hourglass shape here where it goes into the same general width here. Very simplified ideal of a female body. And connecting that off as this generally box shape here. For the arms, nothing really too different from the previous character. I like to think of it in terms of that shoulder as being a clear landmark, going into the elbow here. And I'm not going to worry about the foreshortening because I just want to show the limbs. But it's something like this width and length, going down more narrow into the wrist and that hand box. So this is useful for the start point, midpoint, end point. Not really sure what she's doing. Okay. And so for the legs, she has the very exaggerated kneecaps there, but that's helpful as usual to show the midpoint of the leg. The shapes of these legs here being more feminine means that rather than being kind of a flat cylinder here, it's like going to follow the curve that started here with the waist off of the curve, and before it gets back to the leg, kind of like follow a hump. That's the hump of the butt. And our animated character moved a little bit. It's okay. And so this distance to this distance should be more like that. But this mirror down here for the calf, and following that into this ankle. And I think, yeah, these feet kind of mirror more of a high-heeled kind of shape but not exactly. I'm just going to draw them as regular feet, where it's that kind of flat ankle box extruding into a foot. And likewise on this side. So here's the midpoint of that. That's helpful to this. Finding this midpoint was helpful for me because this was kind of a messy area over here, and I just needed to know where, along which axis, was I going to mirror this other leg. There's that knee. And here's that ankle box. Here's the box where I'm extruding some fingers. This is the thumb. Same over here. Okay, so just like the previous model, understanding the human anatomy with simplified shapes that kind of have a little bit more flexibility to be playful with. So in the case of the model, it's kind of like taking the idea of the shoulders here and being able to play with them and say, okay, you know, I know that this is where the shape should be, but instead of using a traditional shoulder shape, just turning that into, you know, more interesting pointy shape. And for the bicep area here, I think in the original pose, yeah, it's a little more clear now, that this shape is kind of just like, almost like a box like that. And it's okay, it doesn't need to be this longer cylinder like real anatomy would be. You can just kind of swap it out, or in this case I'm just going to draw over it. And this piece kind of like suggests the idea of like a really flexed bicep. So even though, you know, a normal character, when their arm is extending or whatnot, wouldn't really show that, it's okay to do that with a robotic character, because these are just shapes that are in place of the normal parts of the human anatomy. So the cylinder can be exaggerated. If you ever drew it wrong, for example, you could even just say that whatever wrong line you drew is just part of the design of some shapes that just need to be in the correct places, and generally the correct lengths or sizes of the real anatomy underneath. I think there's a really strong case for that here with kind of the armor on the legs, which are much thicker and larger in this particular example. Extruding out from there, you can achieve a similar sort of bulkiness. Okay, so that is the female robot character, and this was more useful for just understanding the basic parts and how they can be exaggerated when you're drawing a robot. But again, this is still really useful because when you end up drawing a real character, let's say you want to draw a human figure with a normal face. If at any point while you're drawing this character you goof up, even on the nose or something, let's say you did it too long or something like that, then you can turn your character to a robot, cover up any details that you drew incorrectly with like some sort of mask. If you like mess up the ear, you can either give her giant robot ears or make them into headphones or something like that. If you're drawing the torso and you had a plan for, I don't know, just like being able to see a human kind of chest or something, but you misdraw the breast shape, then you can turn that into armor. Just kind of generally following the idea or the forms of the underlying human anatomy, maybe pulling out interesting blocky shapes to cover up whatever you might have more difficulty with understanding. Shoulder, okay, yeah, let's do an example of drawing the arm here and hand, and being like, maybe I didn't like the way I drew that. Being able to draw armor and be familiar with the sorts of shapes that you find common in armor, enough that you can cover up mistakes. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about when we want to have a wide enough visual library to be flexible when it comes to fixing or saving a drawing. Or maybe these are the sorts of things that just will expand your creativity to draw different types of subject matter. I think it's interesting that the time periods we're talking about as far as armor versus robots couldn't be further apart as far as human history goes, but they're going to be using a lot of the same concepts for saving drawings. So these hips here, just the general idea of hips and maybe the simple shapes that might cover them up. And so on and so forth with these simple shapes. Okay, I think that about covers it for today's lesson. Now let's move on to the mission, which is a bit of a curveball because it's not going to be about the armored characters or robots that we drew together in class today. I'd like you to go back to your previous two research topics, the one where you studied an object and a creature, and do some more practice with those topics. This is because to truly add something to your visual library, you need to draw it not only a bunch in a row, but kind of over time, returning to those topics just to refresh and truly solidify your understanding of how to draw those things. So just draw an additional 4 pages, however, spread out over those two topics according to how you want to focus your time, and that'll be your mission. Okay, so that's pretty much the class for today. To recap, we went over armored characters and robots to help us understand a simplified understanding of the human figure. And in the next class, we'll be going over the traditional human figure itself. Okay, looking forward to seeing you then. See ya.